While the port welcomes the opportunity to partner with the city to create prosperity, we're exploring our legal options if you continue to pursue this unfortunate effort and that will undermine the port's mission.
Well, that's Port of Seattle Commissioner Fred Fellman speaking to the Seattle City Council back in late February about the SODO housing bill the council ended up passing in March. Turns out that threat of legal action was real. The city has a new battle on its hands this week. Plus, the council's after-hours lounge public safety measure is taking shape. Some new plans to reduce gun violence, too, and a levy renewal in the works this week that might be under your radar. All this and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm joined by my co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I got one for you. I saw a blurb in the rant and rave section of the Seattle Times. Love that section. This was a rave about driving down Highway 305 on Bainbridge Island, where the writer was, quote, enchanted by the daffodils blooming on both sides of the road. The writer goes on to say, the blooms were aesthetically spaced, reminiscent of a trail leading the way in a fairy tale. Again, probably my favorite section of the paper. But David, I was just thinking about this because it sounds like there's a mystery gardener at work here in your ancestral homeland. So will you, on this program, confirm or deny that you planted this fairy tale vision of spring floral splendor? What do you got?
Yeah, I wish I could take credit for it. I know exactly what they're talking about because I drop my son off on Bainbridge once a week and see the daffodils. And yeah, there's like hundreds and hundreds of them. Somebody put in a lot of work. It wasn't me. Daffodils, it's very pretty. Daffodils there would not have been my choice. There are other bulbs that I prefer to daffodils. So if it had been me, I would have chosen maybe, crocuses or snowdrops.
All right, just so long as the truth is out there. David, thank you for sharing that with me. Thanks for being with me as always. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. John, here's looking at you, buddy. Thanks always to our show patrons. Remember, patrons get access to patrons first content before anybody else, plus a snazzy decal sent your way too. The starting level, just $5 a month. So please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and pledge your support. Also, a huge thanks to Converge Media. You will find the video version of this podcast on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's make this happen. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, David, I was wondering when we would see some legal fireworks after the council's passage of a measure to allow for housing in the SODO neighborhood back on March 18th. Turns out I only had to wait a couple of weeks. So David reported about this in the Seattle Times, folks. The Port of Seattle, which was very much against this idea, has been for years, has petitioned the King County Superior Court to overturn this rezoning plan from the Seattle City Council and invalidate this law. David, break it down for us. What's this petition all about? What are the legal avenues the port's trying to pursue here?
I think the kind of main crux of the petition is that the Seattle City Council is doing a rezone to benefit one person, and that person being Chris Hansen of Arena fame, who had tried to build a new Sonics arena in this area. The fact that he owns nearly all of the parcels that would likely be developed here and has been trying to find a plan for these for a long time, the port sees that basically as, it's called a spot rezone, which is a lot of sort of legal wonkiness to it. But at the end of the day, arguing that the port is arguing it's illegal to make this kind of change that benefits primarily one party and that they see as being incongruent with the uses around it, which in this case is industry. Some other arguments, which is, basically that the city should have had to do more environmental review before moving forward with this. Because it's a rezone, they say that it should be treated as a quasi-judicial matter, which then greatly limits how much the Seattle Council people talk to interested parties. They don't say explicitly that the council members were talking to Chris Hansen and his associates, but they are heavily implying that they were. And so, it's sort of kind of some of the threats that they had made in public comment, particularly around the environmental review piece, but they're really narrowing in on the fact that it's primarily going to benefit, at least financially, Chris Hansen.
I never like being a legal handicapper here, but were you surprised at that avenue that they took there with this legal case?
I knew that they would go the environmental review route because they said so as much, in a letter to the Seattle City Council saying they would do that. I'm not surprised. I think there's the rezone process is so kind of, I hate the term quasi-judicial, but it is just more it is more regulated than kind of most legislative processes go. And so in retrospect, I'm surprised we didn't kind of hear more objection about this in the moment because we really didn't hear them make this argument in public at the time.
Right.
Maybe they were kind of sitting on it for court.
Yeah.
I remember one time they were considering a rezone. I don't remember what it was, but somebody in public comment who would have benefited came up and made a case for doing this rezone. And that at the time they considered a quote ex parte communication, basically being this person was getting, unfair advantage in this rezone process.
Right.
So they
right.
had a whole second special public comment period to give the opportunity for anybody to come forward and give the opposite point of view. So again, rezones are highly regulated. So it makes sense to me that the port is taking this legal route.
Yeah, and I just wanted to look bigger picture here to wrap up. If this case succeeds or not, I just see this petition as really an indication of a rough relationship between the port and the city here. I wanted to look a little more closely at this because the mayor did not sign this bill from the council. He let it become law without his signature. Does that indicate there might be some room here to negotiate between the city and the port, work out something and maybe drop this case and somehow move forward? Or how do you look at this?
I think there's two arguments, which is the argument the port would make, which is that Council President Sarah Nelson did not do the kind of outreach that they wanted, that she did not loop them into the process. And they argue that there is a compromise available to them had only they been given more opportunity to discuss it. I think Council President views that argument skeptically, and there's some reason to view that argument skeptically because the port has always been 100% opposed to housing in this area and has never really given a lot of indications that they would ever allow housing here. And Council President Nelson has decided that she wants to put housing there. So whether or not the mayor's office wants to engage in those kind of negotiations, I don't know what that would look like. Probably the port, if they want to have any hope of having some kind of settlement like that, is going to wait until after the election and maybe hope that they get a friendlier city council, and then maybe those avenues open up a little bit more.
Boy, interesting time there. Thank you for breaking that down. Folks, check out that article that David wrote in the Seattle Times, chock full of information. All right, well, up next, I wanted to talk to you, David, about the Public Safety Committee from the council putting the finishing touches on this bill to curb gun violence around after-hours establishments in Seattle. This puts new restrictions on these clubs to have a fully vetted state liquor license that allows a facility to stay open past 2 but not serve alcohol during those times. There are requirements for security officers on site to check for weapons too. We talked about this a few weeks ago on the podcast when the council had first started talking about it, I should say. And then just a few days later after that, we had another deadly shooting at a late night club, the Capri in Rainier Valley. So David, to me, it appears the city wants to crack down on that business in particular. Chief Sean Barnes very recently declared the Capri a chronic nuisance, which isn't something the city does very often. In between what the chief is talking about and the council, what impact do you think this tough on late night lounges approach from the city is going to have?
I think it could have an impact because, when you talk to people about what they're trying to do here, it's pretty specific, in that they have 5 to 10 businesses in mind that they're going to try and target here. It's not like this is a vague problem and they're hoping some regulation can kind of sort it out. If this passes, I think we would see pretty immediate action on 5 to 10 businesses or
establishments,
establishments that are operating after hours. And, the data shows that there is a sort of disproportionate amount of violence at those places. So it could have an effect. The question is always, do they move somewhere else? Do they go further underground? I think that's a risk. But, I think in the short term, it does open the door to pretty immediate enforcement.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how the chief really pursues that nuisance piece of it. One last wrinkle here I saw with this. Seattle's Office of Financial and Administrative Services says the cost to enforce this, including overtime staffing, development of outreach materials, could be about $100,000 in 2025. As it looks right now, the city says that cost could be absorbed by annual department underspend. But I thought this was a fine point on here. Depending on the number of regulated businesses, the city goes on to say, additional appropriations could be required for future enforcement, and those future costs could be recovered through increases in business license fees. This is where I'm getting, David. Do you see this as an issue going forward, a license fee increase that could affect all businesses based on the action of just a few businesses that aren't being good actors? I'm just trying to figure out the sustainability of this enforcement.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I'm sure one that will come up among those businesses. I think we are not particularly close to the Seattle Police Department spending all of the money it has on salaries. I think there's a lot of wiggle room there.
Right.
If enforcement it could get up into the millions, and I still think they could redirect some of that funding. And, the council has been hesitant to do that. There have been some who have advocated for redirecting that funding towards, social services or alternatives to
Sure.
policing. And there's been some hesitancy to do that because anything that smacks of defunding the police has become really
Yeah.
toxic. But in this case, this would be going toward other sorts of enforcement action. So strikes me that maybe that would be a little far off. But at the same time, I think any business is probably going to be wary of anything that could look like a slippery slope.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how this plays out going forward. Thanks for engaging with me on that, David. All right, we're going to work on this next here. Keep going down this path of public safety with a new plan for gun violence reduction across the city of Seattle that Chief Sean Barnes has unveiled. How will this affect your neighborhood? That's coming up next on Now Hear This. Well, late last week, Seattle's new police chief, Sean Barnes, unveiled a new plan to crack down on violent crime and drug trafficking in the city. Statistics for those crimes have been challenging in Seattle over the past few years, starting to go down from pandemic highs, but definitely not as quickly as other cities, and some youth violence numbers there that the city is very concerned about, the King County prosecutor too. So the chief is talking about increased patrols to combat this with something called crime abatement teams, more arrests of violent offenders he's bringing up, and proactive enforcement of gun crimes. He's also talking about more collaboration with not only city officials and the police department, but also community groups dedicated toward public safety, even working on getting them some grant money, as he explained about a few weeks ago to me on the Seattle channel.
Pass-through grants is really one of the things that I want to elevate in our police department, because a lot of times the government will give grants to us, and then we can give that to other people and help with some of the work that we want to do.
An interesting concept there, taking grant money dedicated for public safety, pass it through to groups or nonprofits that could help out police. But David, I wanted to look larger issue here first. What do you make of the chief's plan on violent crime and drug trafficking? I guess it's a bit of a wait and see, but is there any policy jumping out at you here that is significantly different from what the SPD has employed in the past?
In a word, no. Nor does it strike me as particularly different than kind of strategies we see everywhere, which isn't to say that they don't have any kind of value. I mean, I think this falls into the bucket of emphasis policing,
Yeah.
When there's, or hotspot policing, when there's certain areas that you want to focus on, you throw more officers at it. And I think in the short term, a lot of times these do have an effect. You can sort of tamp down, if there's a sort of geographic hook to something, you can tamp down on it and actually make a difference in the short term. The couple concerns with it are A, sustainability. How long do you keep officers on that sort of focus? And, B, in the broader sense, which I don't want to imply this is what's going to happen, but there is certainly a history in this country of these sort of emphasis crime fighting teams being given a longer leash perhaps than they should have. There was the recent killing at, I'm going to forget which state it was in, but super high profile killing of a young black man by a group of officers. So a lot of them were convicted. They were all fired. They were on this sort of crime fighting, I think it was called a strike team. In Baltimore,
Yes.
There was gun team that got pretty out of control. So there is a risk with these kind of highly specialized teams aimed at cracking down on guns and crime that they're given a long leash, and I think it is particularly important that there is good oversight of what they're doing. At the same time, again, when you have a sort of emphasis and you put a lot of cops on that emphasis, I do think it probably will make a difference in the short term. It's just what's the trade-off? What are you not doing as much if you are moving officers in that direction?
Right. I know that their resources are limited. That's certainly a big part of the discussion around the Seattle Police Department right now, too. I'm also thinking about, though, David, the discussion we had last week about this recent city auditor report on gun violence specifically, and how city agencies, at least as of right now, appear to be a bit siloed in their approach here. Do you think Chief Barnes might be someone who can bring those silos together? Is his plan going to be a blueprint to do that? What do you think about that part of it going forward?
Yeah, that was the big piece of that auditor, is that basically we need to get more people in the same room together talking.
Right.
I don't know Chief Barnes well enough to know if he's the guy to do that. I will say that, a new chief certainly presents an opportunity to do that. You're kind of hitting the reset button. He's got this document in his hand saying, here's how we could improve our response to policing or to gun violence. So he has the opportunity to do that. I think there's tension between various branches of government, between the mayor's office and the city council and the police department and the various groups who have a role in this. I don't think it's as easy as them all just, holding hands and coming together on this stuff. Everybody has a fairly different idea of what the right approach is. So
Yeah.
Easier said than done, but I don't see why it's not within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, it's just one of those issues with public safety that crosses over so many different political lines here. Is it the mayor's problem, or is it the city council's problem? Is it the police's issue to deal with? I think you've got to say all three, and a few other agencies at it as well. So I know we're going to see that city auditor's report brought up again in the future, and we'll have to see how the chief responds to it too. So thank you for that, David. I did want to touch on one other thing. It's a relatively lively week for the city council. They're looking to reauthorize the democracy voucher program this week. We talked about that on the podcast a little while ago. They're also looking for a new director for the Office of Police Accountability, high profile position there. But there is one levy renewal they're talking about. You might have overlooked the Families Education Preschool and Promise Levy, the FEP, that the council is discussing this week in the Education Committee, led by Councilmember Maritza Rivera. So voters said yes to the 7-year levy back in 2018 to the tune of $619 million. Now it's time for a renewal here in 2025. This cost the median homeowner a little more than $320 a year. But the mayor said a few months ago in a State of the City, he wants to increase this levy. He definitely said that, and I'm wondering where it might go, especially in light of federal cuts to education programs and childcare out there. David, some thoughts about this? How and where do you see the FEP increasing it? It really looks like it's going down that path.
Well, I will say that this is a pretty popular program the city provides, because through this levy, you get the preschool program and you get community college tuition.
Promise program at the other end. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Promise program at the other end. And, I think this is the sort of sweet spot, I think, for people in Seattle, which is, providing pretty direct services to families who might be stretched thin. And, I know people who have kids in the preschool programs, and they value it. And so I think the mayor in this realm has probably quite a bit of latitude in how big he goes. I think my guess would be it focuses on just expanding what the city already has, because that seems to be the kind of most direct role. Because of course, City Hall isn't in charge of Seattle Public Schools, so it's not
right.
Not dealing with the budget gaps there, but it does have the opportunity, if it wants to, broaden the preschool program to more families and broaden the community college tuition to more people. So I would expect that it just kind of does that, does more of what people seem to already like, rather than maybe, bringing on a bunch of new sort of programming that might seem a little more vague to voters.
Yeah. Well, one piece I'd be interested to see how it pans out, David. I talked a little bit with Chief Barnes a few weeks ago about school resource officers and some of this, at least more security forward type of thinking from the city, and how they might increase that type of security around campuses, especially in light of shootings at Garfield like we saw not too long ago. I wonder if that's going to be a part of this discussion too. Yes, childcare is certainly going to be front and center. I know the state's having some issues with paying for that right now, so the city is going to try to step, I would think, in that way. But does that public safety part of it come into the picture, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good point. I hadn't really thought too much about it. It makes sense. I do think the pendulum has kind of swung back the other direction. I think there's more support for having some kind of law enforcement presence in public schools. I knew that when now Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rink on the campaign trail expressed openness to that idea. That was quite a change from when the progressives were sort of staunchly against this idea. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's where it goes, but I hadn't actually considered that before.
Yeah, there's a lot of different pieces to this, and as always, the devil's in the details. We'll see where this money gets split up over the next couple of weeks and months here as the council works on this. They essentially have to pass something here in the summertime or before summertime to make sure it gets on the ballot in November. So it's something we're tracking there, especially with a Seattle public schools system that is looking for a new superintendent right now. So some shakeups there for the council to consider as well. All right, well, coming up next, a challenging future for the Seattle City Council with a clash of personalities and maybe some election considerations mixed in too. David's done some very interesting reporting on this. We're going to talk about it on What's Next. David, you wrote recently about some of the tensions between members of the city council coming into public view here. We saw a lot of this, I know, during the SODO housing discussion, which we discussed earlier on the podcast here. But are there other examples of this tension coming to the fore that you're noticing? And what does this mean? What kind of fault lines are coming out here?
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of struck me. I kind of grappled with this story a little bit, but it struck me as out of the ordinary how much kind of public questioning there was happening, particularly by Councilmember Dan Strauss of Councilmember Nelson. And these are the two
council members questioning each other on the dais type of thing.
Yeah, and not just on a policy perspective. It was more, I don't want to say personal, but it was kind of got to the heart of how the institution was being run. And this is primarily coming from the two most senior members of the council. So it stood out to me as worth noting. And so, it ended up actually being a little bit more of a story about Council President Nelson than I was anticipating, which is that, you've got Councilmember Strauss and Councilmember Rink basically saying, we think she's politicizing her position as council president, that she's manipulating the committee appointment process and the meeting schedule to serve her own political purposes. Even Councilmember Kettle said something similar during the SODO debates. So I think it sort of got to the heart of something that I had been thinking about, and I think a lot of people talk about with Council President Nelson in particular, which is she has a reputation for being very sort of focused on her goals. She has very specific goals in mind. She is very, in some ways, idealistic about, which is sort of, in the most literal sense of that term, very idealistic about what it is she's trying to accomplish on the council, which is turn back some of the progressive policies that of the last few years, boost up law enforcement, and in this case, build housing in SODO. And I think that singular focus, it's so intense that I think sometimes the people who are on the opposite sides of her on those issues end up feeling sort of whiplash in a way that isn't always the case, I think, with certain members of the council. And you hear this from both her supporters and her opponents, which is, John Scholes, the president and CEO of Downtown Seattle Association, who is one of Council President Nelson's biggest backers, described her as a Shama Sawant type with different ideologies. And by that, he meant she is wholly focused on achieving what she set out to achieve. And if people don't like her along the way, she's not particularly concerned with that. And she would tell you as much, that she's there for a specific purpose. She's not really there to be liked. I think for people like Councilmember Strauss and Councilmember Rink, and to an extent Councilmember Kettle, that can sort of cross in a way that doesn't sit very well with them. But if you're of the same mind as Council President Nelson, that the city needs a fundamental change, and the way that this city council is run needs a fundamental change, then you say, yeah, great, go do what we elected you to do.
Yeah, it is interesting. She is taking the position, I think, differently than some of her predecessors have in that city council president role, because I think you and I have seen it over the years, David. I'm thinking of Council President Juarez when she served beforehand. It was really kind of a titular role. And at that point, they need to be in charge of running meetings and making sure the schedules are all put together. But not very often, if at all, would they sponsor legislation. And in this case, Council President Nelson is stepping right in the middle of some big stuff and leading the charge on it. SODO housing is one example. What she was trying to do with some of the app-based drivers and so forth last year was an example of this as well. I think about that. I think she's kind of taking this position differently. And I guess a lot of people who oppose her are saying, wait, she's using this position. And I guess it's a different approach to the job of council president.
Totally, yeah. I think that's exactly right, which is, despite the title, it has often been treated as an administrative job more than anything. And whereas Council President Nelson sees it as she's sort of the figurehead of this council. And I think it helps that she became the face of a swing council. This is a brand new council that came in with a whole new set of priorities. And she was very happy to be the face of that and try and lead that in this direction, because she saw an opportunity that this was a council that was going to be much more friendly to her agenda. And so by being council president, she becomes the kind of face of that movement away from the progressive council. So where other council presidents were never quite in that sort of symbolic role of representing the council as a whole, they were much more in that position as administrative caretakers, making sure people got their assignments and finding out where the legislation went. Council President Nelson sees this as she is representative of what the city is now as compared to what it was several years ago. And she takes that very seriously. And as a result, we see her launching politically difficult fights. The pay up legislation, the app-based delivery driver legislation, that failed because it was such a fight. And this SODO housing legislation, there was a world in which that could have failed too. But, again, she sees it as kind of part of her broad mission on that council. And if you support that mission, then you love her. If you're uneasy with it, then you probably have a pretty tense relationship with her.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see how that plays out politically, because she is on the ballot coming up this November. Councilmember Rink is on the ballot coming up this November too. Strauss is not, Kettle is not, but those are two high-profile positions here that I don't know. Do you think this is part of the test for Sarah Nelson come this November? Just to wrap this up, David.
I do, yeah. I mean, there's a couple dynamics that's probably worth noting. Is I think Councilmember Strauss, though he denies it, it would be hard to not sort of read into what he wants out of this too. I think he is trying to sort of step into this more statesman senior role there.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, Councilmember Strauss will dispute this, but I think some people in City Hall view him as sort of posturing himself to that he kind of wants to be the senior statesman in this council. And so, I think there is some sense that he is waging these public fights because Council President Nelson is the one who is in his way. Hard to say. I think the election already, we're seeing Dion Foster, who's running against Nelson, sort of talk about how she would bring everybody in to have a respectful conversation, and she would increase the number of stakeholders at the table. And, that is a sort of not so subtle dig at what she's saying is happening, which is not happening under Councilmember Nelson. As we talked about before, I'm sure the Port would love if Councilmember Nelson was not reelected because, they also are, I think, representative of her governing, which is they feel totally disrespected in this whole process. They feel like she didn't give them any heads up or any opportunity to work with her on this legislation. And so they feel super disrespected. Council President Nelson says, this is what I was trying to do. I think you were going to be a barrier to that, and so I did it. That I think sort of encapsulates how she runs that office.
Yeah, fair. Interesting to see how this affects a number of different races coming up here this fall. So thank you for that, David. Great piece in the Times. Again, folks, check that one out. David wrote an interesting spot about that, about what's happening with the council right now. We do need to wrap up, though, David. Back to baseball news, if I could. Most surprising thing about the Mariners this year, is it that they are losing more games than they're winning, or that third baseman Jorge Polanco is one of the leading hitters in the American League? What did you have on your bingo card?
I guess I'm more surprised about Jorge Polanco because I was kind of expecting that they would not be particularly good.
Yeah, right. There's that. Yeah, he's hitting above the back of his baseball card, that's for sure, and carrying them through a couple games here. So we'll see what happens there. It's kind of amazing.
Well, good for him, though. I always wanted him to succeed.
Yeah. When the journeyman guys start to get their due, that is good to see. All right, well, hang in there, Jorge. Hang in there, David. Good to talk to you as always. And thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. If you're not a patron, please do become one. Pledges start at just $5 a month on Patreon. That would be greatly appreciated. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. We are there. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.